Hello, I want to invite you to another discussion on research, and our focus in the present discussion will be on the limitations of study, the way it is understood in social science research. We will look at the meaning of limitations, the causes, and the remedies that researchers can employ to limit the limitations. Limitation also remains a very, very important issue that might affect research, and therefore it is important for researchers not only to understand what it is, but also to understand the causes and ways on how it can be prevented. Welcome to the discussion. Limitation in research refers to the potential weaknesses that are usually out of the control of the researcher and which may weaken the validity and reliability of research findings. Limitations may also refer to restrictions and constraints which arise from methodological approaches adopted in the research. It may also be understood as the weaknesses within a research design that may influence outcomes and conclusions of the research. Researchers are required to present the limitation and prescribe their potential possible effect to the study, and also explain the steps that they will take to mitigate the limitations. Limitations, in simple terms, is any issue that may put into question the reliability and validity of research findings. We are required to make conclusions at the end of the study, but such conclusions must be reliable and valid. And therefore, if they're not reliable and valid, they may raise questions. So anything that is not directly or intentionally created by the researcher, but which come in between and during the study and stands a chance of watering down the quality of research findings, that is what we call as a limitation. Efforts and steps must be taken by researchers to limit their possible effect on the overall validity and reliability of the findings of the studies they undertake. One of the causes of limitation is to do with limited access to data. It should be noted that sometimes researchers are unable to obtain adequate data given the type of study being undertaken. For example, it may be difficult to obtain data from studies that touches on national security or intelligence, or studies that seek to study or understand something about the activities of groups that are proscribed, such as gangs, drug dealers, human traffickers, among others. These groups might not be easily accessible, and even if you do so, they might still withhold certain information that could be crucial in enabling a researcher to fully draw better conclusions about their studies. They may provide information, but very shallowly, and hide from the researcher deeper information which they feel might reveal more about them. Part of the reason why they may conceal such information is perhaps the perception that the researcher could be an agent of the security that is out to investigate and understand what they're doing for purposes of taking actions against them. On the part of security intelligence, normally the intelligence community sometimes find it quite difficult to share information to individuals or groups that they consider are outside the intelligence cycle, because doing so sometimes they believe could compromise the security of the state. Researchers may also fail to access enough data in areas or in studies where very little or no studies have been done, and as such, very little or no literature is available. Indeed, there are always emerging issues, and some of the pioneer studies in some of these emerging areas might find it difficult to get enough information due to the fact that not much is known or not much information is already available about these areas. So in that case, therefore, they might find it difficult to even get a representative sample whose results can be used to be generalized to the larger population. Therefore, lack of valuable data or lack of reliable data may limit the scope of the analysis and may present obstacles in finding a trend or meaningful relationship between variables that are being studied. The other possible cause of limitation to the research is what we call cultural biases. And we need to observe that researchers sometimes may hold biased views due to their cultural backgrounds or perspectives of certain phenomena. And this may affect the legitimacy of the study. For example, a study on wealth among pastoralist communities by a non-pastoralist or by somebody who does not fully understand the pastoral economy can easily conclude that the community is poor based on the type of housing they observe, the clothing they wear, and also the surrounding they live. This interpretation of poverty may be based on the researcher's perception of wealth and not that of the study population. This is because while a pastoralist household may live in what a researcher perceives as a dilapidated house, and also their clothing not as good as he or she expects, and the surrounding not well built in terms of roads, in terms of environmental improvement, the same household may be owning as many as 10,000 heads of cattle in the field. Assuming, for instance, that each animal costs 20 or 25,000, then we're saying that that particular household wealth in terms of livestock possession alone might be in the region of over 200 million. So that interpretation based on what is observed might not reveal the actual picture of what the situation is on the ground. This is because of the perception of the researcher regarding what wealth and poverty means based on their cultural orientation. Therefore, differences in cultural views can contribute to a researcher being biased as they focus only on data that support their views or that lean towards what they know. It's also possible that researchers may have biases towards data and results that only support their hypotheses or arguments. Because at the beginning of every study, a researcher is required to have research questions and or hypotheses. Then sometimes during fieldwork, a researcher might consider any data that does not go along with the hypothesis or research questions as not being important. Yet such data that is being ignored might be what speaks to what is going on the ground. Cultural bias is therefore a very huge limitation that can actually undermine the validity and reliability as well as the quality of research findings. Sample bias is yet another possible cause of limitation to the research. Sampling bias basically refers to errors that occur in research when the researcher does not properly select their participants. It might also be understood as a phenomenon that occurs when research subjects in studies are chosen improperly, which creates an unrepresentative sample. Sample bias can come in many forms, including undercoverage, non-response bias, the recall bias, observer bias, as well as exclusion bias. It means that data is collected from a group in which some members of the intended population have a higher or lower sampling probability than others. This unbalanced sample can affect the validity of the research, data and results, and it can also limit the extent to which conclusions can be generalized to a larger population. There is a topic that we are going to encounter later on sampling, and there will be a subtopic within it called sample bias. So at that stage, we shall understand it more, what it means, and the various types of sample bias. But here, I still want to emphasize that if data is not collected from a representative sample, the possible outcome is that the conclusions might not be generalized or applied to the larger population, because not each and every individual of that population had a chance of being selected and therefore constituting the research participants. When such measures are not taken, then it means that there would be a leaning towards a given section of the population, and that might mean that the results might not be conclusively applied or speak to the larger population. And that's why we see sample bias as a possible obstacle or a possible limitation to research. The other issue that could lead to a limitation or weaknesses of the research findings is to do with the cultural taboo. A cultural taboo can be understood as something which is considered inappropriate within a given cultural group. Some studies may border on issues that a community considers as a taboo topic, such as those bordering on human sexuality among African societies. Participants in such studies may either completely avoid or give little information on such subjects that they consider as taboo in their cultures, leading to the generation of very little or no data at all. It is important for researchers to understand the culture of the target population and any cultural bias that might affect participants' participation in the study, as well as the study results. Cultural taboo may therefore limit the generation of in-depth and honest information, which may raise doubts on the validity and reliability of study findings. Indeed, in some cultures, issues of sexuality or bedroom matters, individuals are not permitted to discuss them with anybody else, apart from those individuals that culture permits. A researcher may sometimes be perceived by members of the community as an outsider and therefore categorized as among individuals that matters of sexuality might not be discussed with. In that case, that perception or that consideration would mean that a researcher may not get sufficient information. Sometimes they may face hostility or total rejection from the participant. If that were to happen, then it means that very little information can be generated or no information at all can be generated. When only a very small proportion of the intended data is generated through fieldwork, it means therefore that the conclusions that a researcher arrives at may not have sufficient and in-depth backing, and therefore it may raise questions about about the data that has supported such conclusions. It is expected of researchers to provide sufficient data, sufficient information, so that it is discernible that the conclusion they have made is supported by adequate evidence, not only adequate, but also reliable evidence. Let us now look at some of the remedies that have been employed by researchers or suggested as possible remedies to some of the limitations that we have listed above. One of these remedies is called triangulations. In research, triangulation refers to the use of two or more data sources or methods, as well as theoretical perspective approaches in the analysis of the study of a single phenomenon and then validating the congruence among them. This method or approach enables researchers to have a comprehensive and balanced approach, which reliability and validity of data collected can henceforth be established. Triangulating data sources also enhances the generalization of study findings, since a researcher can compare and contrast different types of evidence presented and then identify patterns or discrepancies that exist in any. Researchers can triangulate data in the results section, where they present and analyze data using various techniques such as quantitative and qualitative methods, primary and secondary data, or different theoretical frameworks. Triangulation can be a remedy to study limitations such as limited access to data, cultural and sampling bias. I need to emphasize that in certain studies, some research approaches could be more effective than others. And therefore, when used in a combination, it is possible that the limitation of one research instrument can easily be taken care of by the other research instruments. Some information are better obtained using questionnaires, while others are better obtained or investigated using interviews, while some observation might be the most sound and effective method of data collection. So sometimes the use or the employment of a variety of different sampling methods can be of use in terms of enhancing the quality, the truthfulness, and the honesty and integrity of data that's obtained. For instance, assuming we want to understand a student's performance, maybe over the years in a given subject, so that if you ask a student what exactly they have scored, maybe some could tell you they have scored a B, an A, a C, or an F, whichever performance they give you. But to understand how truthful that information is, it might be important for the researcher to now go to the transcript office or examination office and source for recorded data. So secondary data that's available, which contain marks of student performance, can then be compared with what the students gave in order to establish the congruence or differences or discrepancies between what the student gave and what the records indicate. So that's why we say that triangulations can be helpful in terms of increasing the validity and reliability of the data that is gathered. The other remedy that has been put forward by scholars and researchers as being important in limiting or mitigating the impacts of some of the limitations of the study that we have cited earlier is what we call peer debriefing. Peer debriefing refers to the process of consulting peers or senior scholars who have no personal interest in the study to enhance the validity of research findings. Researchers should share the progress of their studies with their peers and senior scholars so that they can review and assess transcripts to establish trends and any inconsistency in the responses. The briefing also allows other scholars to assess whether or not the researcher has missed a key point, overemphasized a minor one, or repeated one or more points. The briefing shows that the researcher is open to learning and improving research approaches, and they value the opinions and insights of others. It also enables researchers to identify and correct any errors, flaws, or biases that may have been overlooked or missed in the research process. We need to emphasize that some senior researchers may have had a lot of experience in research, and the encounter with the different studies, with the different participants, and being in different geographical study locations might give them an edge over upcoming researchers. Because of that, it is important that they are consulted from time to time. Some of them may have experience in terms of which data instrument is more effective in collecting a given when you're covering or when concerned when investigating certain issues, and which one is not. So just by looking at what you want to study, it is possible for an experienced and senior researchers to provide advice in terms of the kind of instruments, the kind of approaches that might enhance the validity as well as reliability of the conclusions that are made. So debriefing remains an important step because from at each and every stage, it is possible that they can advise researchers on what to observe so as to minimize or mitigate certain limitations so as to enhance the quality of the research findings. The other method that has been uh, proposed as a possible remedy to limitation of the study is the use of appropriate sampling method. You noted earlier that we stated that if there are serious errors that occur during sampling, then it might affect the quality of the research findings, and it might be difficult for such research findings to be generalized on the wider population. So researchers have proposed stratified sampling method as one of the remedies to uh, limitations of research, especially that which is associated with sampling bias. This method involves dividing the population into homogeneous subpopulations that are called strata, which is based on specific characteristics. Stratified sampling method is employed when a researcher wants to ensure that every characteristic is properly represented in the sample. This method can be proportionate or disproportionate, in which a proportionate sample refers to equal representation of each stratum in the study. It is disproportionate when the sample sizes of each strata are not equal. Disproportionate sampling method is normally useful when the researcher wishes to study underrepresented subgroups whose sample size would otherwise be too low to allow valid statistical conclusions. The stratified sampling method allows the inclusion of samples with diverse characteristics and subgroups, thereby helping in minimizing limitations of the study which is associated with sampling bias or sampling error. The topic on sampling is one that we are going to look into later, and I think at that point we'll look at the various methods of sampling, the strengths and weaknesses, and then from there I may provide advice in terms of which sampling method is appropriate or which sampling method is useful when you want to undertake a study in any given broader area. I want to thank you for your time and for listening, and at that point I come to the end of our discussion on the limitations, or rather on limitations as an issue in social science research. Thank you so much.